هذا هو جيش التيراكوتا. 8000 محارب دفنوا قبل أكثر من 2000 عام. إحدى أعظم عجائب العالم. يعد جيش التيراكوتا من أشهر الاكتشافات الأثرية في تاريخ البشرية.
This is the Terracotta Army. 8,000 warriors, standing in silent formation, buried for more than 2,000 years beneath the plains of Shaanxi province. It is called one of the greatest wonders of the ancient world. And every year, millions of visitors lean over the railings of those excavation pits and stare down at row after row of clay soldiers, certain they understand exactly what they are looking at. They do not, because beneath the feet of those warriors, hidden under layers of packed earth that have not been disturbed since the Qin dynasty, there is something the emperor never wanted the world to find. And when a team of independent researchers finally got permission to scan beneath the surface, what came back on their screens was not what anyone expected. Not treasure, not simply a tomb. Something far stranger and far darker. This is the story of what that scan revealed. A hidden architecture of tunnels, sealed chambers, and disturbed ground that tells a different story than the one carved into museum placards. A story about an emperor who was not just planning for death, but trying to outrun it, and about everyone he was willing to bury along the way. Most visitors fixate on the warriors themselves. 8,000 individual figures, each one with a distinct face, armor, and posture, arranged across pits that stretch far wider than most people realize. But the warriors are only the entrance. The full underground complex is believed to cover several square miles, and archaeologists who have studied the broader layout have concluded that the man who ordered its construction was not simply preparing a resting place. He was building a complete duplicate of his empire, buried beneath the real one, so that if his dynasty ever collapsed above ground, he would still command an entire civilization below it, permanent, obedient, and entirely his. That is why the complex is filled with clay stables, sculpted animals, and bronze tools that remain functional after 2,000 years underground. There are clay waterfowl positioned beside a recreated riverbed. There is farming equipment, kitchens, and administrative offices, all built in miniature permanence, because the emperor intended to want for nothing in whatever came next. But there's a theory that goes further than simple preparation for the afterlife. Some historians believe this man was not resigned to death at all. He was trying to defeat it entirely. The historical record confirms that the first emperor of a unified China spent decades obsessed with immortality. He financed expeditions to the edges of the known world in search of a legendary elixir. He consulted alchemists and mystics, and he consumed substances his own advisors promised to extend his life indefinitely, substances that, based on later analysis, likely poisoned him instead. This was not myth or rumor. It is documented in surviving court records. He believed death was a problem that enough resources and enough force could eventually solve. And when his search above ground failed, the theory goes, he turned his ambitions underground instead, into the tomb itself. Some scholars now argue that the entire complex was never meant to function only as a grave. It was designed as a machine, a ritual engine built to pull the emperor's spirit back across the boundary, separating the living from the dead. Every soldier, every channel carved for flowing liquid mercury, every constellation painted onto the ceiling of the inner chamber was a working part of that machine, a map meant to guide his spirit home. It sounds like superstition until you notice the precision. The soldiers are not arranged randomly. They face east, toward the territories of the states he had conquered and the enemies he still feared. Even in death, he positioned himself for the next war. Nothing about this site was accidental, and that is exactly what convinced one investigator that there was more waiting beneath the surface than anyone had been told. The researcher at the center of this discovery is a geophysicist named Dr. Elena Marsh, who spent years working with ground scanning technology originally developed to locate buried structures and unexploded ordnance in conflict zones, instruments precise enough to read the composition of the earth the way an X-ray reads a human body. She had worked in restricted archaeological zones before, but nothing fully prepared her for what awaited her at this site, where sensitive sections had been sealed off from outside researchers for decades under strict government oversight. Drone flights were banned across the entire complex. Every scan required sign-off from multiple layers of authorization. Even veteran archaeologists who had worked on-site for years often operated without a full picture of what lay beneath their own excavation trenches, because the information had been deliberately compartmentalized. Different teams knew different pieces. No single outside researcher had ever seen the whole picture. How Marsh's team secured access to some of the most restricted sections of the site has never been fully explained publicly. What is clear is that from the moment her team arrived, the atmosphere was tense in a way that had nothing to do with the summer heat. Officials monitored every piece of equipment before it was allowed near the pits. Every drone flight required a fresh, individually approved request. Every scan was performed with someone standing directly behind the team, watching the readouts in real time. Marsh later said that standing at the center of the complex felt like being inside a space that had never been built for the living, and she meant that literally, not poetically. Very few outsiders had ever been permitted to stand exactly where she was standing, let alone point scientific instruments at what was buried beneath it. She moved through chambers that had been sealed for over 2,000 years. Warriors rose around her in every direction, some frozen mid-stance as if about to draw a weapon, others holding a strange, deliberate stillness. She saw wooden chariots with wheels still structurally intact, stables containing clay horses posed mid-stride, as if waiting for a rider who would never arrive, and bronze weapons sharp enough, even now, to draw blood. Tools lay abandoned mid-task, as if the craftsman had simply stepped away and never returned. Every pit felt like a single frozen moment stretched across 2 millennia. But Marsh had not traveled halfway around the world to admire the artistry. She was there to find what the human eye could never detect on its own. The scanning began with ground-penetrating radar, a technology that fires precise pulses of energy into the earth. When those pulses strike something solid, a wall, a cavity, a mass of compacted material, they bounce back to the surface and gradually build an image of what lies hidden below, a picture made entirely of reflected shadows and echoes. When the first images resolved on the monitors, the team went quiet. There were walls that appeared on no existing architectural survey, vertical shafts plunging more than 100 feet straight into the earth, and dense clusters of small, tightly packed objects that no one on site could immediately identify. One theory suggested these clusters represented the Emperor's personal effects, everyday belongings reproduced in permanent materials, so they would endure into the next world alongside him, exactly the kind of possessions a man obsessed with eternity would insist on keeping close. A second, far darker theory began circulating among the team almost immediately. What if the radar was not picking up objects at all? What if it was picking up remains? Not clay figures standing in symbolically for real people, but the actual members of the Emperor's court, placed underground to continue serving him in death exactly as they had in life. The deeper the scans reached, the less the underground landscape resembled an organized funerary complex, and the more it resembled something chaotic. Layer after layer disturbed earth, shadow formations with no architectural explanation at all. What was forming on those monitors was not the picture anyone on the team had prepared for. For decades, no aircraft had ever been permitted to fly over this site. The airspace above it was effectively treated as classified. Marsh's team became among the first allowed to fly scanning equipment above the burial complex and observe it from altitude, using LiDAR, a laser-based imaging system capable of cutting through vegetation and surface soil to map buried structures with remarkable precision. From above, the scale of the hidden network beneath the known pits became unmistakable. Buried walls extending well past any previously recorded boundary, collapsed chambers absent from every existing survey, and large sections where sizable numbers of people appear to have been interred simultaneously. Several of these locations carried thermal signatures consistent with ancient fire vents, heat absorbed into the ground, and preserved there for over 2,000 years. Then the team reached the section that stopped the project cold. Beneath the feet of the clay soldiers, the scans revealed clusters of irregular, disturbed cavities in the earth. Too chaotic to be intentional architecture, but too patterned to be the product of ordinary geological shifting. The configuration matched something forensic archaeologists recognized instantly: mass graves. The surrounding soil showed compression and fracturing consistent with sudden, forceful movement, not the slow, even settling of centuries, but the concentrated violence of something catastrophic happening quickly. According to historical record, roughly 700,000 laborers were conscripted to build this complex over multiple decades. For generations, the assumption was that most of these workers eventually returned home once construction ended. The The new scan data complicates that assumption considerably. If even a fraction of that workforce was sealed inside the complex once their labor was no longer needed, the Terracotta Army stands above one of the largest concentrated burial sites in ancient human history, and the theory that has circulated for centuries, treated for a long time as folklore, is that the construction project itself was used as a tool of political elimination. Rivals, dissidents, and anyone who learned too much about the tomb's true layout were assigned to labor crews under the guise of national service, and once their usefulness ran out, they simply never left. The radar data does not conclusively prove this theory, but makes it far harder to dismiss than it once was. Soil disturbance patterns consistent with what forensic geologists call struggle layers, earth mixed and compacted by bodies in motion, appear throughout several of the deeper tunnel systems, and in some sections, the scans detected metallic signatures consistent with mechanical crossbow triggers, devices ancient texts describe as being built into the tomb specifically to kill intruders automatically. Near the center of the survey, Marsh's team identified an anomaly that broke from every surrounding pattern. A single isolated void, older than the structures around it, dug notably deeper, as if someone had wanted it placed beneath everything else. Hidden, unreachable, deliberately forgotten. Inside that void, imaging revealed a single skeleton, arranged with obvious care, unlike the chaotic mass burials nearby. The remains belonged to a young man, likely in his early 20s, and the objects buried alongside him were not the possessions of a laborer or a prisoner. They were costly, high-status items, the kind carried only by someone born into real power. What silenced the room, though, was what the imaging showed inside the skull, a bronze arrowhead lodged deep in the bone. Not the debris of a nearby battle. A precise, deliberate act, carried out on someone who had then been buried alone, carefully, in a location specifically designed so no one would ever find him. Historical sources confirm that the first emperor had numerous sons, and that several of these princes vanished from the historical record without explanation. Names that simply stop appearing in court documents, with no account of death, exile, or disgrace, as if the record itself had been instructed to forget them. As Marsh's team studied the burial's positioning, the quality of its grave goods, and the extraordinary effort taken to hide it from anyone above, a difficult picture began to form. This was very likely one of the emperor's own children, killed not by an outside enemy, but by an order from within his own family. The chamber's dimensions matched something closer to a holding cell than a tomb, and stress markers in the bone suggested the young man may have survived in that confined space for weeks or months before he was killed. There's a long-standing historical theory about who gave that order. The emperor's successor, a son who seized the throne after his father's death, and is widely believed to have systematically eliminated every sibling capable of challenging his claim. Marsh's team went on to find several additional voids around the main mound, matching dimensions, depth, and placement, a pattern consistent with an entire generation of royal children buried alongside the laborers and prisoners who had built their father's tomb. In sealed chambers near the primary burial site, the team also recovered fragile bamboo scrolls, preserved for 2,000 years and requiring painstaking, weeks-long conservation work under tightly controlled humidity and temperature. What the surviving text recorded was not a celebration of the emperor's achievements. Historians who reviewed the translated fragments described them instead as closer to a record of abuses, documentation of a state ruled through fear, including an imperial order to bury several hundred scholars alive for holding philosophical views the emperor had not personally sanctioned, and records describing the mass burning of texts across the empire, an effort to erase any body of knowledge that might allow people to imagine governance differently than the one they lived under. Other fragments preserve confessions signed by builders and engineers accused of vague, expansive offenses, insufficient speed, association with someone already under suspicion, a chain of accusation with no logical endpoint, after which the accused joined the dead already buried beneath the complex. The scrolls also expand on the emperor's documented obsession with immortality, describing fleets sent to search for a legendary island said to hold a life-extending elixir, fleets that, according to these records, were never expected to return, because returning empty-handed would mean publicly confirming that the emperor was, after all, a mortal man. Some passages, still only partially translated, appear to describe a ritual intended to animate the buried army itself, Whether meant literally or symbolically remains debated among historians. But what is not in dispute is that the emperor's belief in this project's supernatural power was genuine, not performative. At the very center of the entire complex sits the one location no archaeologist, government official, or research team has ever entered, the emperor's primary burial chamber, sealed for over 2,000 years and still sealed today, not from lack of desire, but because of what waits there. Soil samples taken around the central mound show mercury concentrations hundreds of times higher than anything found naturally in the surrounding region, lending strong physical support to ancient written descriptions of engineers constructing rivers of flowing liquid mercury inside the tomb to represent the empire's waterways in miniature. If the chamber were open today, the pressurized environment sealed inside it for 2 millennia would vent outward immediately, releasing mercury vapor at concentrations capable of causing serious harm within minutes. There is precedent for the danger of exposure more broadly. When a smaller subsidiary pit was opened decades ago, painted pigment on the clay soldiers inside began flaking away within seconds of contact with open air, an irreversible reaction triggered by the sudden shift in humidity and pressure. Colors preserved for 2,000 years vanished before conservators could intervene. If the central chamber holds silk, wood, or painted surfaces, as ancient records suggest it might, opening it could destroy the very history it contains in the same moment it is finally revealed. Martian scans of the central structure only reinforce what ancient texts had already implied. This tomb was engineered specifically to remain sealed. The mercury, the mechanical defenses, the sheer depth, the compartmentalized secrecy, all of it built by a ruler who understood that someone eventually would try to get in. So far, that boundary is held, not out of reverence, but because the people who understand what a breach would actually cost have chosen restraint over curiosity. What lies beneath the Terracotta Army is not simply a monument to imperial power. It is a seal, one holding down the remains of laborers who died where they worked, political rivals erased from the historical record, scholars killed for their ideas, and children of the emperor's own bloodline killed to protect someone else's claim to the throne. 8,000 soldiers still stand above it all in perfect formation, facing east, guarding a story that was never meant to have witnesses. The full central chamber remains closed, and for now, the only honest answer to what waits inside it is that no one alive has actually seen it. Only the shadows the earth has been willing to give up so far.